March 1945, England. A fog-drenched airfield near Leiston, wind cutting like a knife across the hardstand. The war was almost over, but you'd never know it by the noise. Engines coughed, hammers rang, and men shouted through the fog like ghosts keeping the sky alive. Inside a drafty maintenance hangar, one man was laughing, not because of victory, but because everyone around him thought he'd lost his mind. Staff Sergeant Frank "Red" Dalton stood knee-deep in engine parts, sleeves rolled, hands black with oil, sparks hissing off a welding torch. Before him sat a P-51 Mustang stripped of its nose cowling, its famous Packard-built Merlin engine half disassembled. Dalton's eyes gleamed under the hanging light bulb. He wasn't following a manual. He was rewriting it. Across the hangar, two mechanics leaned on a crate, grinning. "You're going to turn that bird into a bonfire, Red," one said. The other chimed in, "You trying to make her fly or cook breakfast with that coffee pipe?" Red didn't even look up. He just kept tightening the new line he'd installed. A loop of copper tubing running from the intercooler housing into a valve assembly no one had ever seen before. "Boys," he said, "this here's either going to make her faster than sin, or make me famous for the world's loudest explosion." They laughed harder. "You can't run that much boost. She'll melt herself." Dalton wiped his hands, lit a cigarette, and took a long drag. The flame glowed off his scarred knuckles. "Engines don't melt," he said. "They just quit too soon." At the far end of the hangar, a pilot in a leather jacket, Lieutenant Russ McKay, walked in holding his flight gloves. "Red, you sure this isn't suicide?" Dalton shrugged. "That depends. You afraid of flying faster than a German jet?" That got everyone's attention. The laughter stopped for a second, replaced by disbelief. A mechanic snorted. "A jet? You're out of your damn mind, Red. This bird tops out at 440 on a good day." Dalton flicked his cigarette onto the floor. "Then we're due for a better day." He climbed onto the wing, motioning McKay toward the cockpit. "Start her up. Let's see if she screams or sings." Outside, the morning mist rolled low across the runway as McKay primed the starter. The P-51 coughed, sputtered, then roared, louder than anyone had ever heard before. The sound filled the hangar deep and sharp, like metal being torn in half by thunder. Men covered their ears, stepping back. "Jesus, Red, what did you do to her?" "Gave her a reason to live," he shouted over the roar. The Mustang's tail shook against the chocks, the prop slicing the fog into ribbons. McKay throttled forward, the manifold gauge climbing higher than regulations allowed. 75 inches. 80. 85. Dalton grinned through the smoke, watching the numbers rise into forbidden territory. Then McKay released the brakes. The P-51 lunged forward, wheels kicking mud, tail lifting in a heartbeat. It thundered down the runway, the roar turning sharper, angrier. At the edge of the field, it lifted off, almost vertically, climbing straight into the gray sky until it disappeared into cloud. Silence fell in the hangar. One mechanic whispered, "That ain't possible." Dalton looked up through the fog where the Mustang had vanished, a faint echo of its engine still fading into the distance. He smiled and said quietly, "It is now." In 1945, the jet was supposed to be the future, and everyone else was supposed to accept that. German engineers said piston engines had reached their ceiling. Even Allied intelligence agreed. The Me-262 could cruise at over 500 miles per hour, and the best the P-51 could do, on paper, was 435. The math looked absolute. The laws of physics looked settled. The manual said so, the generals said so, the engineers said so. Frank "Red" Dalton didn't. To him, limits weren't laws. They were lazy assumptions. Every mechanic on that airfield lived by the same mantra: follow the book. The book said the Merlin V1650 engine could safely handle 67 inches of manifold pressure. No more. The book said the turbo supercharger would choke out if pushed beyond redline. And the book said that exceeding factory parameters meant engine seizure explosion, or death. Red read the book once. Then he used it to prop up a coffee pot. He'd spent his childhood in Oklahoma, where tractors were resurrected with fence wire and common sense. He'd learned that an engine was more animal than machine, that if you fed it, cooled it, and gave it reason, it would always give more. When he joined the U.S. Army Air Corps, that instinct clashed hard against bureaucracy. Supervisors hated him. Pilots loved him. His official record read like a comedy of contradictions: repeated violations of maintenance procedure, unauthorized carburetor adjustments, exceptional aircraft performance observed. When a superior caught him hand-polishing cylinder heads with kerosene and denim, Red shrugged. "Engines breathe, sir. Just helping them inhale." To the brass, he was reckless. To the airmen flying home on half-dead planes, he was a miracle worker. Yet even Red had been told that the P-51 couldn't climb with the new German jets. The Me-262s and R-234s were rewriting the sky, cutting bomber formations apart like sharks among minnows. The pilots joked darkly, "You can't fight what you can't catch." That was the line that broke him, because Dalton didn't believe in can't. He tore into the problem like a mechanic tearing down a stubborn tractor. The issue wasn't the propeller or the wings. It was the breath. The Merlin engine's supercharger was throttled by regulation, literally. A restrictor valve kept the pressure from spiking too high. To Red, that wasn't safety. That was suffocation. He'd argue with the engineers over mess hall coffee. "The Germans don't play by the book. Why should we? They'll blow their engines. They'll win while they do it." He started sketching ideas in the margins of old maintenance logs. Airflow redirections, bypass routes, intercooler tweaks. None of it was approved. All of it was dangerous. To most, it looked like madness. To Red, it looked like math. The human kind of math. The kind that says if you push something hard enough, it either breaks or evolves. And on one cold night in that hangar, with oil freezing in the drums and his cigarette burning low, Dalton decided to find out which one the Mustang would do. He wasn't building a modification. He was building an argument. One that said man, not machine, defines the limit. The next morning, the laughter began. Frank "Red" Dalton earned his nickname long before he ever touched a P-51. In the fields outside Tulsa, his hands were always coated in rust, oil, and blood from stubborn machines that didn't want to live. He grew up poor during the Dust Bowl, fixing whatever his family couldn't afford to replace: tractors, windmills, engines with more hope than metal. His father once told him, "You don't own tools, boy. You earn them every time something breaks." By the time he was 16, he could rebuild a carburetor from memory. By 20, he could tell if an engine was dying by the way it vibrated through the floorboards. When the war came, the Army didn't have to draft him. He volunteered. Not to fight, but to build. "You give me metal, I'll make it fly," he told the recruiter. They laughed. Then they saw his test scores. In the Air Corps, Dalton was a mechanic among bureaucrats, a grease-stained poet in a world of engineers. He didn't quote theory, he spoke torque and temperature. When new recruits panicked over manuals, he'd listen to the engine idle and say, "She's talking too fast, ease her mix." It unnerved officers who lived by procedure. His maintenance bay was filled with unapproved tools: leather straps, kitchen wire, even a modified garden hose that he swore worked better than regulation coolant lines. One supervisor wrote in his report, "Dalton's methods produce unacceptable results by acceptable means." But his planes always came back. He treated each aircraft like a living thing. He'd thump the fuselage before takeoff, whisper, "Don't quit on me," and light a cigarette as the pilot taxied away. Pilots began fighting to have him assigned to their planes. "If Red worked on it," they said, "it'll make it home or die trying." Then came the arrival of the P-51D, sleek, fast, and deadly. The perfect machine, or so everyone claimed. Red didn't buy it. Perfect machines don't exist, he said. Only machines that ain't been tested enough yet. He loved its Merlin engine, 1,490 horses packed into liquid-cooled fury. But he hated how it was choked by design. Every bolt screamed potential, and every safety valve whispered cowardice. They built her like she's scared of herself, he muttered. That frustration built into obsession. At night, when others slept, he'd sit under a flickering bulb in the hangar, tracing the airflow diagrams of the supercharger system with a cigarette ash. He noticed something no one else cared to. The intercooler duct's bypass route was overly conservative, but meant to protect the engine, not unleash it. And that's when the spark hit. What if, he wondered, he could feed the engine hotter air for a few seconds, just long enough to climb higher, to catch a jet before it leveled off? It wasn't engineering. It was instinct, the same kind that kept tractors running through dust storms. By the time he drafted his modification on a scrap of notebook paper, his fingertips were stained red from copper grease. He looked at them and smiled. "Fine," he said. "If the book's too scared to fix it, I will." That night, he began the most dangerous experiment of his life, not to break an engine, but to free it. By the spring of 1945, the numbers were merciless. Every chart, every report, every mechanical limitation screamed the same truth. The jet had won the race. On paper, the P-51 Mustang's Packard-built Merlin V1650 engine could produce 1,490 horsepower at sea level, with a maximum rated manifold pressure of 67 inches of mercury under war emergency power. That was the ceiling. Push it higher, and detonation would eat the pistons alive. The German Me-262, by comparison, produced nearly 2,000 pounds of thrust per jet engine, with no gear reduction, no propeller drag, and no mercy. At full speed, the jet could hit 540 miles per hour, almost 100 faster than the Mustang. Every Allied pilot knew those numbers and hated them. Bomber escort missions were turning into death sentences. For every 10 P-51s that climbed to intercept, at least 2 never came back. And of the ones that did, half returned with engines burned out or compressors shot. The war had turned into a contest of altitude. Whoever could climb first won. Dalton studied the math with a mechanic's disgust. "It's not power we're losing," he muttered to himself. "It's breath." He wasn't wrong. At 25,000 feet, the Merlin engine lost 18% of its air density due to thinning atmosphere, and the supercharger could only compensate up to a point. That meant every piston stroke delivered less fuel, less compression, less thrust, like a man gasping through a straw in the thin air. Dalton knew that wasn't a design flaw. It was a safety feature, and to him, safety features were the enemy of war. He started scribbling numbers on an oil-stained clipboard. Boost ratios, air-fuel curves, coolant loss, intercooler efficiency. His handwriting looked like chaos, but there was order buried inside. He circled one phrase 3 times. Feed the lungs, not the heart. In his mind, the P-51 wasn't starving for fuel. It was suffocating for oxygen. The supercharger's airflow loop, designed for gradual pressure, restricted the one thing it needed most at high altitude: raw air velocity. Dalton proposed something ridiculous: bypass the regulator entirely for short bursts. Let the air in unfiltered, ungoverned, unapproved. It would spike boost pressure by up to 18% for perhaps 20 seconds, just long enough to climb or break away from an attack. Every other mechanic thought it was suicide. One even bet him a week's pay it would melt the heads clean off the block. But Dalton's logic wasn't guesswork. He'd studied the Merlin's metallurgy, its thermal tolerances, and its overboost recovery rates from maintenance reports. He knew the aluminum pistons could withstand peak pressures of 250 psi for brief bursts. He knew that the coolant system had a 5-second buffer before boiling over. In short, he knew exactly how long he could dance with death. He called the concept the hot lung bypass. Officially, it didn't exist. On paper, it was impossible. In practice, it was about to make history. When Dalton filed his experimental mod under Field Adjustment Proposal F-112, the engineering staff sent it back stamped in red. Rejected. Violates design limitations. Unsafe for implementation. He taped that rejection note to his toolbox. It became his checklist. Later, one of the pilots would say, "Red didn't fix engines, he provoked them." That was true. Because Dalton didn't see machines as fragile. He saw them as fighters. And in a war where man and metal alike were being pushed past human limits, maybe the only way to win was to stop believing in limits altogether. The night before the test, the hangar at Leiston Airfield looked like something out of a fever dream. A half-disassembled Mustang sat under a single flickering bulb, surrounded by the tools of heresy, scavenged piping, scraps of copper wire, and the coffee percolator that had become legend among Dalton's crew. He'd ripped it apart earlier that evening, stealing its curved copper tube for one reason. It matched the airflow curve he'd sketched in his notebook. "Best espresso I never had," he muttered, welding the tubing into the supercharger bypass line. To anyone else it looked ridiculous. To Dalton it was art. By midnight, his hot lung bypass was in place. A small handmade valve tied directly into the intercooler duct, connected to a toggle hidden beneath the throttle quadrant. It had no safety cutoff, no regulation, and no business being on a military aircraft. At 0600, Lieutenant Russ McKay arrived, coffee in hand, squinting at the patchwork of solder and wires. "You really think this will fly?" Dalton didn't look up. "If she doesn't, we'll know quick." McKay laughed nervously. "That's not the confidence I was hoping for." Dalton gave him a look that was equal parts pride and challenge. "You wanted to see what she can do? This is it. But listen close. Don't hit the toggle unless you're climbing or dying." Outside, dawn broke cold and pale. The airfield shimmered with frost as McKay's Mustang, tail number 414221, taxied onto the runway. Ground crewmen stepped back, trading uneasy glances. They'd heard stories of Dalton's experiments before. None had ever been this extreme. "Red, you copy?" McKay's voice crackled over the headset. "Loud and clear," Dalton replied from the hangar, eyes locked on his field radio. "Keep it under 70 until you're airborne, then give her hell." The engine roared to life, deeper and harsher than usual. The new copper piping vibrated, whining like a wild animal under pressure. McKay eased the throttle forward, and the plane shot down the strip like it had something to prove. At 1,000 feet, he hit the first checkpoint. The manifold gauge read 65 inches. Normal. Then he reached 10,000 feet and flipped the switch. What happened next made every man on the ground forget to breathe. The engine's pitch changed instantly, a howl unlike anything they'd heard. The Mustang leapt upward, nose slicing through cloud like a knife. The climb rate doubled. The pressure gauge redlined at 79 inches, holding steady. "Red, you reading this?" McKay's voice was strained but alive. "It's working. She's pulling like a damn rocket." Dalton didn't answer at first. He was too busy watching the altimeter readings feed back through the test monitor, his pencil trembling. "Keep her steady," he said finally. "She'll hold for 20 seconds before she starts boiling." At 25,000 feet, the coolant temperature hit 270 degrees. The boost line quivered. McKay was laughing now, not out of fear but disbelief. "Red, I just passed 30,000 and she's still climbing." Back on the ground, the crew stood in silence, watching a contrail carve a perfect white spear through the morning sky. Then the radio crackled again. "Engine's coughing, I'm cutting boost." Dalton slammed his fist on the table. "Damn it, I said 20 seconds. But the Mustang didn't die. It coughed, sputtered, and then, miraculously, leveled off. The manifold pressure dropped back to normal. The bypass had worked exactly as planned. Minutes later, McKay brought the plane down, shaking but alive. The ground crew swarmed it. The exhaust pipes glowed cherry red. The cowling paint blistered, but the engine block was intact. One mechanic stared at the gauge readings in disbelief. "You just climbed 4,000 feet a minute," he said. McKay grinned. "Yeah, and we just rewrote the damn sky." Dalton exhaled slowly, lighting a cigarette. "Told you she'd either scream or sing." Then, as the laughter died down, he muttered under his breath, "Looks like she did both." By the end of that week, 3 more Mustangs had been quietly fitted with Dalton's hot lung bypass, though no one dared write it down. It spread the way all good heresies do, whispered from crew to crew, built out of scrap and nerve. Pilots loved it. Command didn't even know it existed. The results were immediate and brutal. The modified planes climbed faster, turned harder, and burst through clouds like artillery shells. But the price was measured in fire, noise, and metal fatigue. Each test flight came back with exhaust manifolds warped, spark plugs fused to the block, and coolant tanks spitting steam. The mechanics called it flying on borrowed time. Dalton just called it flying. He began charting his results in a small leather notebook, tracking every minute of overboost, every degree of heat, every second between redline and rupture. He wasn't reckless. He was calculating chaos. Here's what the math said. Standard P-51D climb rate, 3,200 feet per minute. Hot lung bypass climb rate, 4,800 feet per minute, a 50% increase. Average engine lifespan under the mod, cut in half. But Dalton's logic was cold and unforgiving. Engines are replaceable, pilots aren't. That line spread faster than his modification. It became gospel among the Mustang squadrons that fought deep escort missions into Germany. The men started to call it Dalton's doctrine. Every mechanic knew the risk. The bypass valve could overheat in 15 seconds if mishandled. A pilot who held it too long would ignite his manifold and roast the coolant line. But every pilot who'd ever faced a jet knew what those extra 15 seconds were worth. On March 19th, one of Dalton's planes, flown by Captain Elias Doc Rourke, proved it. During a bomber run over Frankfurt, his squadron was ambushed by 3 Me-262s. Rourke flipped the bypass and climbed straight through the contrail layer, stalling the lead jet mid-turn. The 262 tried to dive but couldn't recover. Rourke fired one burst, and the jet disintegrated in mid-air. It was the first time in the war a piston fighter had caught a jet. The squadron radio went silent for a full 5 seconds before someone whispered, "Holy hell, it worked." But when Rourke landed, his Mustang's engine was smoking, oil pressure zero, radiator lines ruptured. The airframe barely held together. Dalton met him on the tarmac, grinning despite the destruction. "You burned her alive," he said. Rourke grinned back. "Yeah, but she took one with her." Dalton didn't sleep that night. He sat in the hangar staring at the melted valve assembly, the charred remains of his invention. It had done exactly what he built it for, and that scared him more than failure ever could, because now command would notice. Sure enough, the next morning, an officer arrived with a clipboard and a tone colder than steel. "Sergeant Dalton," he said, "we need to talk about these modifications." Dalton just smirked. "You mean the ones that are keeping your boys alive?" The officer didn't answer. There was a silence between them, the kind that separates those who follow rules from those who win wars. Dalton knew he'd crossed a line. The brass didn't like miracles they didn't authorize. But what he'd built couldn't be undone. It had already escaped into the field, burned into the collective instinct of every pilot who refused to die politely. Machines could melt. Rules could break. But the sky could be beaten. April 1st, 1945. Skies over the Ruhr. The world's most powerful air fleet was hanging in the balance. Hundreds of B-17s flying toward Dortmund, flanked by silver flashes of P-51s. Below them, Germany burned. Above them, the jet age waited to pounce. At 24,000 feet, the call came through the radio net. "Bandits, 9 o'clock high. They're fast." It was the word no pilot wanted to hear. Jets. Lieutenant Russ McKay, the same man who'd first tested Dalton's ridiculous engine mod, pulled his Mustang left, squinting against the sun. 3 dark shapes streaked down from the glare. Me-262s, faster than bullets, slicing through formation. McKay's wingman screamed through static, "Can't turn with them! They're climbing through us!" The Mustangs broke formation, each pilot diving instinctively to keep speed. But McKay didn't dive. He climbed. "Red, if you're listening," he whispered to himself. "Time to prove you're crazier than they said." He flipped the hidden toggle, Dalton's bypass. The manifold gauge spiked, engine howling like something alive. The P-51 jolted forward, then up, the nose pitching nearly vertical. Contrails shredded behind it. The altimeter spun. 25,000 feet. 27,000. 30,000. "Red line 2, where the hell are you going?" a pilot shouted. "Up!" The Me-262s, caught in a climbing turn, were momentarily slower, their jet engines gasping for acceleration after each burst of thrust. The lead German pilot, Oberleutnant Franz Eberhardt, saw the silver Mustang rising toward him and laughed. Unmöglich, he thought. Impossible. No piston could follow a jet uphill. He was wrong. At 31,000 feet, McKay's guns opened fire. 4 .50 calibers spat tracers that arced through thin air, slicing into the Me-262's left engine. The jet burst into flame. The pilot ejected too late. The canopy vanished in fire. The second 262 veered off, trying to roll inverted, but McKay stayed with it. Throttle jammed forward, the overboost still engaged. The plane vibrated like a living earthquake. The prop tips glowed orange. The sound, deafening, primal, tore through his headset. "Come on, baby. Just a little more." Dalton's mod held. For 31 seconds, a lifetime in combat, the P-51 outran physics itself. McKay squeezed the trigger again. Another burst. The second jet's right wing exploded, shearing off in midair. It spiraled into cloud and vanished. The third German, panicked, broke off the attack completely. The remaining jets dove away, disappearing into the haze at 500 miles per hour. McKay pulled up into level flight, breathing hard. His gauges were redlined across the board, coolant boiling, oil pressure collapsing. The cockpit stank of burning paint and metal. "Tower, this is Red 2, he said into the mic, voice shaking. "Engine's gone to hell, but I'm still airborne." Back at the airfield, mechanics were already gathering. They'd seen the contrails, the impossible climb, the jet that fell like a comet. When McKay touched down, the Mustang rolled to a stop, steam pouring from every seam. The entire left side of the cowling was charred black. The copper tubing of Dalton's bypass glowed like molten glass. Dalton was waiting on the tarmac, cigarette between his teeth. He didn't say a word at first, just stared at the melted metal. Then at McKay, alive and shaking. McKay climbed down from the cockpit, grinning through soot. "You were right," he said. "She didn't melt. She bit." Dalton exhaled smoke, his voice low. "How many?" "2." A slow smile. "Then she earned the heat." The next morning, the squadron logged the encounter. The official report simply read, "Engagement with Me-262 formation. 2 confirmed kills. P-51D performed above rated climb envelope. Cause, unknown." Unknown, but not unremembered. The pilots called it the climb that shouldn't have happened. Dalton called it proof that limits are only real if you believe in them. 3 days after the climb that shouldn't have happened, the base at Leiston went quiet. No laughter, no chatter, just a low current of tension humming through the hangars, the kind of silence that meant inspectors were coming. At 0700 hours, a jeep rolled up bearing the insignia of the 8th Air Force's Engineering Command. 2 officers stepped out. Crisp uniforms, clean gloves, eyes like razors. They weren't here for congratulations. They were here for an inquest. "Staff Sergeant Frank Dalton," one said, reading from a clipboard. "You are ordered to report for technical review regarding unauthorized modifications to Army Air Force property." Dalton looked up from his workbench. cigarette half lit, wrench in hand. You mean the thing that saved your jet's asses? The officer's jaw twitched. You mean your illegal bypass system that nearly exploded over the Ruhr? Dalton didn't flinch. Nearly. They escorted him to the commander's office, a dim room that smelled like stale coffee and paperwork. Colonel Hale, the squadron CO, sat behind the desk, his face unreadable. He'd been a pilot before the war turned him into a bureaucrat. Somewhere behind his eyes, Dalton could still see the man who loved the sound of engines. The inspector laid out the evidence: photos of melted copper tubing, test reports showing manifold pressures exceeding 80 inches, fuel consumption spikes, temperature red lines. This, the officer said, tapping the chart, is a death wish in mechanical form. Dalton crossed his arms. Funny. The pilot who used it is still breathing. The inspector glared. Do you even realize the danger? You risked catastrophic detonation. That plane could have blown apart mid-air. Dalton leaned forward, eyes hard. And if it didn't, it could outclimb a jet. And it did. A long pause. The only sound was the clock ticking on the wall. The colonel finally spoke. Red, what were you thinking? Dalton took a breath, voice calm. Sir, every damn day we lose men because someone in an office decided engines have limits. I just stopped pretending they do. The inspector turned to Hale. You can't let this slide. If word of this mod gets out, we'll have every grease monkey in Europe trying it. The Air Force can't have mechanics playing God. Hale looked down at the report again, then sighed. The deep, tired sigh of a man who knew paperwork wasn't going to win the war. You're right, he said quietly. But I also can't court-martial the man who gave us the only piston plane that's ever beaten a jet. The inspector's pen froze mid-air. Colonel, Hale stood up, voice rising. You'll file that report as mechanical anomaly due to atmospheric compression variance. Do I make myself clear? The inspector hesitated. That's falsifying. It's victory, Hale snapped. Dalton said nothing. He just stared at the desk, realizing that his crime, his miracle, would vanish into the bureaucratic fog of war. As the officers left, Hale turned to him. You understand, Red, there won't be a medal for this. There won't even be a footnote. Dalton smiled faintly. Don't need one, sir. Every time one of our boys makes it home on a cooked engine, that's my citation. The colonel smirked. You're a stubborn bastard. Dalton shrugged. Takes one to fly, one to fix. By that afternoon, the base was back to normal. Officially, the hot lung modification never existed. Unofficially, 10 more Mustangs were fitted with it before the week was out. The Air Corps never acknowledged the change. But the mechanics did. They passed it down in whispers, in half-told stories, in tools left accidentally on workbenches. The lesson spread faster than any directive. When the book says stop and the sky says go, listen to the sky. When the war ended, the official report said the Mustangs won the skies because of pilot training, superior range, and tactical coordination. They never mentioned the copper wire, the bypass valve, or the grease-stained sergeant who refused to accept factory limits. But among the men who flew, the ones who came home with shaking hands and scorched planes, there was no mystery. They knew what really gave them an edge. It wasn't horsepower. It wasn't luck. It was Red Dalton's madness. His modification had quietly spread across the European theater in the war's final weeks. Some versions crude, others refined. A web of unapproved genius keeping the American air fleet alive. By May 1945, over 24 P-51s had some form of the illegal throttle fix. Each one was faster, meaner, and less obedient than before. The math of defiance was simple. A 12% boost in climb rate. A 15% drop in intercept losses. Zero acknowledgement from command. Dalton never saw himself as a hero. I just did what the sky told me, he once said, lighting another cigarette beside a gutted engine block. Engines talk. You just gotta listen to the rattles between the rules. Years later, a post-war engineering report at Wright Field quietly referenced an anomalous performance enhancement in recovered P-51 airframes. The investigators dismissed it as field variability, but one line, a mechanic's margin note, told the truth. Dalton was right. It works. God help us if they find out why. The hot lung bypass was never patented, never sanctioned, and never replicated in post-war designs. But its spirit lived on, in the willingness of men who refused to let fear or bureaucracy dictate survival. Because that's what the war was, at its mechanical heart, not a contest of machines, but of minds. The Germans had the engineers, the Americans had the improvisers. One built the future, the other bent it. When Dalton left the service in '46, he packed his entire life into a single wooden crate, a wrench, a photo of his crew, and the melted remains of that first copper pipe. He opened a garage in Kansas, fixed tractors, rebuilt pickup trucks. Never spoke about the war unless someone mentioned the Mustangs. Then his eyes would flicker just for a moment, and he'd say, "Yeah, I made one of those run hotter than hell." He died in 1972, long before historians began calling men like him unsung innovators. But every time a modern jet mechanic overrides a limiter, every time a pilot trusts feel over instrument, Dalton's ghost is there in the hum of the engine and the tremor of the throttle. The last P-51s to carry his modification were scrapped in the 1950s. But the legacy wasn't metal, it was mindset. Because machines obey, men like Red Dalton decide. And in that decision, in that single act of defiance, the war in the air tilted just enough to favor freedom. The book called it impossible. Dalton called it Tuesday. 2 decades after the war, an air show in Texas brought together veterans, pilots, and a few surviving P-51s restored to their wartime colors. Among the spectators was an old man in oil-stained jeans leaning against a fence, cigarette smoldering between his fingers. On his cap, a faded patch, 352nd Fighter Group. The name on the tag, Frank Dalton. When the announcer's voice crackled through the loudspeakers, "Ladies and gentlemen, the North American P-51 Mustang." The crowd looked up as a polished silver fighter tore across the sky. The roar shook the ground. Dalton didn't move. He just smiled, slow and quiet, eyes locked on the plane like he was listening for a familiar whisper. As the Mustang rolled inverted and climbed hard into the blue, a mechanic beside him murmured, "Never thought an old bird like that could still do it." Dalton exhaled smoke. "She always could," he said. "You just had to let her." He didn't tell the man that the climb, that impossible vertical rise, was the same maneuver he'd made possible 30 years before with a length of stolen copper tubing and a busted wrench. He didn't need to. The machine was telling it for him. That was the beauty of engineering born in desperation. It didn't ask permission. It left no signature, no plaque, no patent. Just results, the kind that echo long after the names fade. When Dalton died a few years later, the only thing found in his garage besides rusted tools was a small brass plate. It read, "If the book says no, ask the engine." The world would never know his name. But every aircraft that bends the limits of its design, every jet that pushes beyond redline for one more second of survival, still carries his spirit. Because victory in World War II wasn't written in factories or command rooms. It was written in grease and sweat, in hangars lit by cigarette glow, in the quiet defiance of men who believed the sky could be beaten if you were willing to break the rules. That's the legacy of Frank Dalton, the outlaw who taught an army how to listen to machines, the mechanic who rewired the impossible and gave freedom wings. When the Mustang's echo faded into the wind that afternoon, the crowd clapped and went home. But for one old sergeant, long gone now, the sound still lives somewhere in the static of history, an engine running hotter than the manual allowed. And that's how legends really fly.